In the gentle, rolling hills on the outskirts of a sprawling American metropolis, there lay a farm that seemed almost suspended in time. The land stretched out in every direction. A vast expanse of green fields, orchards, and weathered barns that had withstood generations of storms and seasons. This farm, a living testament to the enduring spirit of rural America, was not merely a piece of property. It was home, heritage, and the very embodiment of independence. At the heart of this estate was John, a rugged yet thoughtful farmer whose life had been inextricably linked to the land since childhood. John was not your typical modern entrepreneur. Rather, he was a keeper of tradition, a man who valued the slow, deliberate rhythms of nature over the hurried pace of city life. With calloused hands that had tilled the soil and eyes that had seen both the beauty and brutality of nature, John had developed a deep, almost spiritual connection to his farm. Every furrow in the field and every crack in the old wooden fence carried stories of sweat, determination, and the love of a man for the land he tended. John's personality was as steadfast as the ancient oak tree that stood guard at the edge of his property. Independent, resolute, and imbued with a sense of quiet defiance, he had long prided himself on the idea that the land was a legacy to be preserved against the encroaching tide of modernity. He believed in the simple values of hard work, self-reliance, and community. A community built on mutual respect and the shared understanding that the earth was not for sale to the highest bidder. Yet, not far from John's pastoral refuge, the modern world was creeping in. Just beyond the horizon, the sprawling city buzzed with relentless energy, a stark contrast to the slow, rhythmic pulse of the countryside. In the suburban neighborhoods that skirted the rural outskirts, a different kind of power was at work. Here, the Homeowners Association, HOA, had taken on the mantle of order and progress, albeit in a manner that often concealed its true ambitions. Initially formed with the promise of preserving property values and ensuring a harmonious living environment, the HOA had evolved into a formidable force, armed with strict regulations and an ever-expanding vision of community improvement. The members of the HOA presented themselves as benevolent guardians of the neighborhood, their polished smiles and well-tailored suits belying an insidious undercurrent of greed and control. They prided themselves on their ability to manage the minutiae of community life, from landscaping rules to architectural guidelines, while their true goal was to transform the character of the area to suit modern, profit-driven aspirations. Slowly but surely, their interventions began to encroach upon the freedoms that long had been the birthright of residents like John. From the very beginning, John had harbored a deep-seated skepticism toward the HOA. For him, the land was more than just a financial asset. It was a living history, an inheritance passed down through the generations. Any interference in how that land was managed, or any attempt to impose a sterile, cookie-cutter vision of progress, was an affront to everything he held dear. When the HOA first began to make minor adjustments to the neighborhood, installing uniform street signs, enforcing strict color palettes for house exteriors, and even dictating the type of shrubs that could be planted, John remained silent. After all, he was a man of principle, believing that rules were necessary for order. But as these rules began to intrude upon the natural ebb and flow of life on the farm, his reservations grew into outright defiance. In the local community, many families shared John's pride in maintaining their traditional way of life. Neighbors would gather on warm summer evenings to swap stories, share home-cooked meals, and celebrate the harvest with communal festivities that had been passed down from their ancestors. These families, with their time-worn traditions and deep-rooted beliefs in self-reliance, saw the land as a source of identity, a connection to the past that modern regulations threatened to sever. They remembered a time when success was measured by the yield of the crops, the strength of community bonds, and the honor of preserving a way of life that was uniquely theirs. As the HOA's influence spread, what began as seemingly well-intentioned guidelines gradually turned into a full-scale intrusion. Subtle at first, the regulations soon escalated into overt demands that began to alter the very nature of the landscape. John found himself at the center of a growing conflict. The HOA's relentless push for modernization and strict adherence to a standardized aesthetic clashed violently with his desire to nurture the land according to its own natural course. Their plans for development, which promised convenience and order for some, threatened to obliterate the rich tapestry of history and nature that defined his farm. The tension between John and the HOA was palpable. In town meetings and heated public forums, John's voice emerged as a solitary beacon of resistance. He argued that the essence of the community lay not in rigid conformity, but in the unique character of each individual property, a character forged through years of hard work, familial bonds, and a deep, respectful dialogue with nature. His rhetoric resonated with many who feared that the relentless march of modernity was poised to erase the very soul of their rural heritage. At the same time, the HOA, with its polished presentations and legalistic language, claimed that their actions were in the best interest of all residents. They insisted that standardized developments and modern infrastructure would not only boost property values but also bring prosperity and safety to the neighborhood. In their eyes, John's attachment to outdated traditions was a hindrance to progress, a stubborn adherence to the past in the face of an inevitable future. Thus, the stage was set for a dramatic confrontation between two very different visions of life. On one side stood John, the embodiment of a simpler, time-honored existence where the land was revered as both a livelihood and a legacy. On the other, the HOA, representing a modern, corporate approach to community management, which sought to mold the landscape according to its own profit-driven agenda. This clash of ideals, both noble in its own right yet fundamentally at odds, would come to define the unfolding drama. A story where the battle for control over a piece of land would echo far beyond the boundaries of a single farm. In this delicate balance of tradition versus modernity, the seeds of rebellion had been sown. John's inner resolve hardened with each new rule imposed, each inch of land stripped of its natural character. And so, as the early morning mists began to rise over his fields, John's heart filled with a quiet determination. The farm was not merely a piece of property. It was a symbol of resistance, a bastion against the forces that sought to homogenize and sanitize the world around him. The struggle was just beginning, and in this clash of wills, the future of not only his farm but the very spirit of the community hung in the balance. It began on a seemingly ordinary early morning. The sky was painted in soft hues of pink and lavender as John prepared for another day on his cherished farm. Yet, as he stepped outside to greet the dawn, an inexplicable commotion caught his attention. A rumbling sound that grew steadily louder, punctuating the silence of his otherwise peaceful land. John's eyes widened in disbelief as he beheld a sight that seemed more fitting for a nightmare than the tranquil reality he'd known for decades. In the distance, a convoy of vehicles had gathered near the edge of his property. Heavy machinery, bulldozers, cement mixers, and flatbed trucks had already begun their work. As he moved closer, the full horror of the situation unfolded. Workers, dressed in the unmistakable uniforms of the Homeowners Association, HOA, were pouring concrete directly onto his fields. The concrete flowed like an unstoppable tide, quickly encroaching upon the fertile soil that had sustained his family for generations. The announcement they offered was as hollow as it was shocking. The concrete was meant to form a new parking lot for the community. Yet, there was no prior notice, no discussion with John, no regard for the sanctity of his land. For John, whose life was entwined with every blade of grass and every furrow of the earth, this act was not only a physical desecration but an emotional betrayal. His heart pounded as he watched the relentless, mechanical advance of modernity over his heritage. As the day progressed, the situation grew even more dire. The concrete, once fresh and malleable, began to set, spreading over his fields in an unyielding blanket. It crept over the boundaries of his orchards and past the weathered barn that had sheltered his family's memories. With every inch that the concrete advanced, John felt his world being stripped away, each patch a stark reminder of the intrusion of corporate greed into his personal sanctuary. In the midst of this unfolding crisis, John attempted to reach out to the HOA. His calls were met with vague, almost bureaucratic explanations. The representatives on the phone insisted that the construction was a community necessity, a decision taken for the greater good, and that any inconvenience was merely temporary. Their words, devoid of empathy, only deepened John's sense of isolation and betrayal. Here was a group that once had the pretense of protecting the neighborhood, now acting as unyielding agents of progress, trampling on his rights and heritage without remorse. As news of the incident spread through the local community, reactions were polarized. Some residents, whose own properties had already been subject to the increasingly heavy-handed regulations of the HOA, began to murmur in support of John's plight. At neighborhood gatherings and in hushed conversations over fences, many recalled a time when the community was a close-knit family, bound by mutual respect and shared traditions. They lamented the erosion of these values as the HOA's modern mandates began to dominate every aspect of their lives. In these quiet corners, John's shock and outrage resonated as a rallying cry against an overreaching authority. Yet, not everyone was ready to stand up. A significant number of neighbors, frightened by the potential legal repercussions of opposing the HOA, chose silence over defiance. They worried that any form of protest could lead to lawsuits or fines, risks that would jeopardize not only their properties but also their tenuous sense of security. This division among the residents only amplified John's isolation, making him feel as if he were standing alone against an insurmountable tide of institutional power. Amidst the chaos, John took to walking along the edge of the concrete expansion, his steps heavy with disbelief and sorrow. Each step felt like a painful reminder of how quickly his legacy was being overwritten by the relentless march of progress. The concrete wasn't just a construction material. It was a symbol of everything he had fought to preserve. The freedom to manage his own land, the right to honor his family's history, and the intrinsic connection between man and nature. His internal turmoil was compounded by vivid flashbacks of simpler times, a time when community decisions were made over shared meals and long conversations under starlit skies. Back then, the community thrived on personal bonds and mutual trust, not on the cold, impersonal dictates of a bureaucratic institution. Now, as he watched the concrete harden under the morning sun, that sense of communal warmth was replaced by an overwhelming bitterness. The very people he had once called friends were now divided, some ensnared by the allure of modernization and others paralyzed by fear. Determined not to let his voice be silenced, John began gathering evidence. With a mix of frustration and steely resolve, he documented every inch of the encroaching concrete with his old camera. Each photograph was a testament to the invasive actions of the HOA, a visual record of a betrayal that was as tangible as the hardened concrete beneath his feet. He knew that these images, though seemingly simple, could someday serve as irrefutable proof of the damage being done, not just to his farm, but to the community's spirit. Despite the mounting tension, a few neighbors mustered the courage to approach him. They came quietly, offering whispered words of sympathy and tentative support. In small clusters, away from the prying eyes of the HOA enforcers, they discussed what could be done. Their discussions were laced with both hope and apprehension. The hope that together they might challenge the overreach, and the apprehension of confronting an entity that wielded legal and financial might far beyond their collective power. The palpable tension in the community was further exacerbated by the HOA's calculated efforts to minimize the impact of their actions. Public notices were posted that day, bearing legal jargon that attempted to frame the concrete pouring as a necessary routine upgrade. These notices, cold and impersonal, did little to soothe the collective outrage. Instead, they served as stark reminders that behind every official statement lay a series of decisions made in boardrooms, far removed from the realities of those living on the ground. As dusk fell and the sky turned a deep, somber blue, John sat on the creaking porch of his farmhouse, his eyes fixed on the darkening outline of the concrete. The day had been filled with a barrage of emotions: shock, anger, sorrow, and a dawning realization that his fight was not merely about reclaiming lost land, but about resisting a broader assault on a way of life. The concrete, unyielding and permanent, was a physical manifestation of the HOA's ambition to reshape not just the landscape, but the very fabric of the community. In that quiet, reflective moment, John resolved that he would not allow this violation to go unanswered. His heart, though heavy with loss, began to kindle a fierce determination. He knew that the battle ahead would be arduous and that he might face isolation and legal challenges, but he also recognized that the soul of his land, and perhaps that of the community, depended on his willingness to fight back. The shock of the day had transformed into a burning resolve. John understood that the concrete would not erase the history written in the soil, nor would it destroy the spirit of those who believed in preserving their heritage. The real war was just beginning, a battle between the timeless values of tradition and the cold calculus of modern development. And as he stared out into the night, John vowed that he would not rest until every inch of that concrete was reversed, until his farm was reclaimed, and until the community once again found its voice against the forces that threatened to silence it. Thus, the stage was set for a conflict that would echo far beyond the boundaries of one farm. The concrete had come pouring in with all its destructive might, but in its wake, it left a spark of resistance that promised to ignite into a full-blown rebellion against the encroaching tide of institutional power. John's shock and heartbreak from the previous day had hardened into steely resolve. Determined to uncover the truth behind the concrete invasion and the inexplicable actions of the Homeowners Association, HOA, he embarked on a solitary investigation. Every night after the dim glow of the farmhouse lamp faded, John pored over documents, emails, and whispered accounts he'd collected from local residents. His determination led him to a trail of inconsistencies that hinted at a much larger conspiracy than anyone had suspected. Late one evening, while sifting through old HOA meeting minutes he'd managed to discreetly copy, John noticed peculiar financial entries and references to off-the-record meetings. These documents revealed that the HOA board had been secretly negotiating with shadowy real estate investors. The goal was not merely to improve the community, as they claimed, but to pave the way for lucrative deals that would transfer control of prime parcels of land into private hands. Every page John read deepened his conviction that the HOA's actions were driven by personal greed rather than communal benefit. John's investigation soon took him to a series of clandestine meetings held in dimly lit back rooms of local diners and abandoned barns. In one such meeting, he encountered a former HOA employee who, fearing for his own safety, shared damning details about the board's hidden transactions. The employee spoke in hushed tones of a high-stakes plan. The construction of a sprawling parking lot was merely a cover-up for a massive real estate coup. The evidence pointed to a deliberate attempt to seize valuable farmland and rezone it for commercial development, a move that would permanently alter the character of the community. With each revelation, John felt both anger and urgency. He knew that time was of the essence if he were to stop this insidious plot. Realizing that his solitary efforts would not suffice against an organization bolstered by legal muscle and financial power, John began reaching out to his neighbors and fellow farmers. He organized secret meetings under the cloak of darkness, inviting those who had suffered under the HOA's increasingly heavy-handed policies. In the hushed privacy of an old barn, the group gathered, residents with weathered faces and weary eyes, yet burning with a shared passion for preserving their heritage. It was in this charged atmosphere of whispered plans and determined glances that John unveiled the evidence he had painstakingly gathered. The turning point came when John laid out the financial records, contracts, and recorded testimonies before the assembled crowd. As he explained how the HOA's actions were not isolated incidents but part of a coordinated effort to profit at the community's expense, a palpable sense of outrage filled the room. Neighbors who had long remained silent over fear of retribution began to voice their dissent. There were those who recalled previous minor transgressions, a rule about the type of lawn ornaments allowed here, the color of house doors there, that now seemed to be part of a broader, manipulative strategy to control every aspect of life in the neighborhood. Emboldened by the collective fury, John proposed a radical solution. He would buy out the HOA. It was a bold, almost unthinkable maneuver, a complete reversal of roles. Instead of being subject to the HOA's dictates, John would assume control of the very organization that had wronged him. The plan was as audacious as it was risky. By pooling resources from the community and leveraging the evidence of corruption, John believed he could force the board to relinquish power. The idea was simple in theory. If the HOA's strength lay in its control over community decisions, then seizing that control would dismantle its ability to impose its will. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of covert negotiations, tense confrontations, and strategic maneuvers. John and his allies started by reaching out to smaller investors and sympathetic members within the HOA itself, those who had grown disillusioned by the board's secretive dealings. In a series of tense meetings held in quiet, unassuming offices, John presented his case. He argued that the HOA had betrayed the trust of the community by prioritizing profit over people, and that a complete change in leadership was the only viable path forward. His impassioned speeches, laden with both personal conviction and hard evidence, began to sway even the most skeptical among them. However, not everyone was convinced. The board's top executives, with their slick suits and rehearsed talking points, were determined to quash the rising insurrection. They deployed a barrage of legal threats and public relations spin to discredit John's movement. Public notices appeared, warning residents of dire legal consequences for interfering with established community protocols. Yet, every attempt by the board to intimidate was met with an even stronger resolve from the grassroots movement. In heated town hall meetings, John's supporters confronted board members with pointed questions about the secret deals and the true purpose of the parking lot construction. One fateful evening, after a particularly charged public forum, tensions reached a boiling point. John, along with a group of resolute farmers and residents, marched to the HOA's headquarters. The building, an imposing structure with pristine offices and polished floors, suddenly seemed like a symbol of everything that was wrong. A fortress of unchecked power and corruption. With a mix of righteous indignation and calculated determination, the group demanded a face-to-face meeting with the board. What followed was a dramatic standoff, with John's voice echoing through the marble halls as he laid bare the evidence of deceit and mismanagement. In that moment, the balance of power shifted, and the board began to falter under the weight of public scrutiny and internal dissent. As the crisis reached its zenith, negotiations took on an almost revolutionary tone. John, now the figurehead of a community uprising, announced his intention to purchase the controlling shares of the HOA. The audacity of his plan sent shockwaves through the corridors of power. Legal teams from both sides clashed in a series of frantic, high-stakes meetings, where every word and every signature could tip the scales of justice. The struggle was not merely for financial control but for the very soul of the community, a battle between old values and modern greed. In the midst of this tumult, John's steadfast leadership and unwavering commitment to his roots became the rallying cry for change. The concrete that had once symbolized an irreversible encroachment was now, in the eyes of many, a catalyst for a transformative uprising. With every passing day, more residents joined the cause, contributing funds, time, and spirit to the effort to reclaim their autonomy. The movement was no longer a small, isolated protest. It had evolved into a full-blown revolution, challenging a system that had long oppressed the individual voices of its community. In the final days of the confrontation, as negotiations reached fever pitch and the future of the HOA hung in the balance, John stood resolute. He had turned personal tragedy into a battle for justice and had ignited a flame of rebellion that could not be easily extinguished. The crisis, once confined to the borders of a single farm, now threatened to upend the entire neighborhood's status quo. The HOA, stripped of its previous aura of invincibility, now faced a formidable collective of residents ready to fight for a community defined by fairness, transparency, and respect for its heritage. John's counterattack was more than a mere purchase of shares. It was a decisive stand against the dehumanizing forces of corporate greed. His actions not only promised to restore the dignity of his own farm, but also offered a beacon of hope for every resident who had felt marginalized by an overreaching institution. As the dust settled on that tumultuous chapter, it became clear that the true victory lay in the community's reclaimed voice, the collective courage that had risen to challenge an oppressive regime, and the unyielding spirit of a man who dared to fight for what was right. In the aftermath of the fierce battle for the soul of the community, dawn broke over a transformed landscape, a landscape that bore the scars of conflict but also the promise of renewal. John stood at the center of it all, a figure both weathered by hardship and emboldened by victory. The oppressive concrete that had once symbolized the invasive overreach of the HOA was slowly being chipped away, replaced by the unmistakable green hues of life and hope. In that moment, John's triumph was not just a personal victory. It was a resounding win for every resident who had dared to dream of reclaiming their autonomy. After weeks of relentless struggle, a watershed moment arrived when John successfully acquired the controlling shares of the HOA. The final act of the takeover was as dramatic as it was unexpected. In a tense boardroom showdown, with the once imposing figures of the HOA's executives visibly shaken by the uprising of their own community, John declared that the era of unchecked power was over. The corporate machinations that had long kept the residents at bay were dismantled piece by piece. With legal maneuvers, public support, and undeniable evidence of corruption laid bare, the new management, now led by John and a committee of community representatives, set about reforming the entire system. The first order of business was to halt the construction of the parking lot, a project that had come to symbolize the destruction of tradition in favor of profit. The halted project sent shockwaves through the corridors of power, proving that even the most deeply entrenched systems could be stopped when the people united for a common cause. In place of the concrete slab, plans were drawn up to restore John's farm to its former glory. The once devastated fields, marred by industrial intervention, were gradually revived. New initiatives were launched to ensure that the land would be used in harmony with nature, preserving the historical and emotional significance it held for generations. John's victory resonated far beyond the boundaries of his farm. As news spread across the county, communities that had long suffered under the weight of oppressive regulations found inspiration in his story. A wave of grassroots movements began to ripple outward, each one echoing the sentiment that every piece of land and every home was a treasure not to be sacrificed at the altar of profit. The reformed HOA, now a model of transparency and democratic decision-making, became a beacon for others, a living testament to what can happen when power is reclaimed by those it was meant to serve. The transformation was not merely physical. With the concrete removed and the land restored, the hearts and minds of the community were mended as well. Neighbors who had once been divided by fear and uncertainty now came together in a spirit of camaraderie. Town hall meetings, once fraught with tension and dissent, evolved into forums of constructive dialogue. Ideas were exchanged freely, and decisions were made with an eye toward preserving the community's heritage while embracing progress on their own terms. The reformed HOA implemented policies that celebrated diversity in property aesthetics and allowed for a balance between modernization and tradition. At the heart of this change was a powerful message. Self-determination and community solidarity can triumph over the impersonal forces of corporate greed. John's journey, from a solitary farmer fighting against overwhelming odds to a leader of a burgeoning revolution, became a symbol of resilience. His story was celebrated not only for the reclamation of his land, but also for the broader lesson that the strength of a community lies in its willingness to stand together against injustice. It was a reminder that when individuals refuse to be passive recipients of decisions that affect their lives, the very foundations of power can be redefined. In the weeks that followed the takeover, John used his newfound authority to launch a series of reforms aimed at preventing the recurrence of such abuses. The HOA's management structure was overhauled, with clear guidelines established to ensure accountability and public participation. Financial operations were made transparent, and every decision was subjected to rigorous public scrutiny. The goal was to create a system where every member of the community had a voice, a system where progress was measured not just by economic metrics, but by the quality of life and the preservation of cultural heritage. Yet, even as the community celebrated its hard-won victory, there lingered an air of cautious optimism. The battle had been won, but the war against unchecked power and rampant greed was far from over. John understood that while the concrete had been removed and the land restored, the deeper scars of the struggle would take time to heal. There remained a persistent question. How can a community safeguard its future against those who might seek to undermine its autonomy once again? The answer, John believed, lay in vigilance and unity. He began organizing workshops, town hall meetings, and public forums designed to educate residents about their rights and the importance of active participation in local governance. His message was clear. The true power of a community is not in the hands of a few, but in the collective will of its people. Every resident had a role to play in preserving the legacy of the land, ensuring that the mistakes of the past were not repeated in the future. As the season turned from the bitter chill of winter to the hopeful bloom of spring, the community experienced a revival that was as much spiritual as it was physical. New crops were planted in the rejuvenated fields, and children once again ran freely between rows of blossoming orchards. The restored farm, now a vibrant symbol of resistance and renewal, became a gathering place for celebrations, a reminder of the community's resilience in the face of adversity. Even as John's personal journey came full circle, he was acutely aware that his victory was but one chapter in a much larger narrative. A narrative that was still being written by the collective efforts of countless individuals across the nation. The reformed HOA had set a precedent, a challenge to other communities grappling with similar issues of power abuse and corporate overreach. Across the country, stories began to emerge of residents banding together, questioning authority, and demanding accountability. In that sense, John's battle was not an isolated incident but the spark that ignited a broader movement for democratic reform. In the final moments of this transformative saga, as the sun dipped below the horizon casting long shadows over the rejuvenated fields, John gazed out at a future that was both uncertain and full of promise. The concrete scars of the past were healing, replaced by the vibrant greens of a land reborn. But the journey ahead was one of continuous vigilance, a journey that required constant effort and unwavering commitment to the ideals of justice, unity, and self-determination. The story ended on an open note, leaving the community and the reader with questions about the future. Would the reforms stand the test of time? Could the spirit of collective action truly fend off the lure of easy profit and centralized power? John's eyes, reflecting both hope and determination, spoke of a future where these challenges would be met head-on, where every victory was a step toward a more equitable and resilient society. In that lingering twilight, as the echoes of the past mingled with the promise of tomorrow, one truth remained clear. The heart of a community is its people, and when united, they possess the power to shape their destiny.